Okay, now in this one, we're going to be talking about why your red areas are not pro-business next to your blue areas that are in the country. It's actually going to surprise you because most people think that when it comes down to regulations, when it comes down to tax rates, but they're going to think that this is what makes uh, a state or an area pro-business or not, and there's actually many more factors that goes into it. When we start to look at it, we're going to see that the first of all, we need to look at what each area is putting in and taking out of the uh, for tax revenue and through public programs. This is the easiest way to tell when we're talking about productive areas. And when we start viewing this, you're going to see that the GOP or red areas with it are not exactly what you think they are. First of all, is when we start to view the actual makeup of what these areas are putting, what the states are putting in next to what they're pulling out. This is a major key to discuss: are they actually pro-business? Are they actually anti-business? And when we start to look at the red states next to the blue states, now mind you, I'm a libertarian with it, so I'm only going off facts, and I don't really care about what it calls who I'm insulting here on either side. But this is basically what we see is that your blue states are actually putting in more money than they're taking out. Red states are taking out more money than they're putting in. The only exceptions to the rule with it are basically Florida and Texas, which are breaking even. And this is an actual big issue when it comes down to if we were to view 50 independent states. Uh, in the Union, if we were to make 50 independent states, your red states would go bankrupt because they could not sustain themselves. Whereas these blue states would actually flourish uh, if they would keep the same policies going right through. They would actually flourish uh, and have uh, pretty much huge amounts of money they could actually keep in their state. They would actually, if they would keep the same rates that are actually going federally and apply them directly to their state. If we would actually go with and eliminate DC and just apply that. Now this means that there's a huge productivity issue. This means no matter what these areas are saying we're going to offer these companies, they're just not coming in. They're not luring in enough companies. We can even see when it comes down to the map of where your red areas are next to your blue areas. Your blue areas are actually high concentration areas, and that means when we start to look at other nations, you'll actually see the high concentration means there's actually a high amount of productivity. The more concentration, the better. This shows you that basically that there are jobs there. There's jobs there. There's actually high paying jobs there. When you go away from that, with it, you're going to notice that the jobs just aren't there. The further away you get, when you go to the suburbs, you're going to get less and less there. When you go to the rural areas, you're going to get uh, a lot less. Rural areas just do not produce anything, and people can complain about the things like oh, but there's farm goods and stuff like that with it. That's not actually production when it comes down to trade. You don't get much value on corn or wheat or soy. You're not going to get much value on it when it comes down overall. And when we start to view the other way, you're not going to see the you're on the blue areas with it. They have basically they're actually producing large products as well as they're producing the products, but they're actually producing very, very lucrative services as well. This is why when people need actual services, major services, they're actually going to the urban centers. Uh, If you're in Wisconsin, you're going to be going either to Madison or Milwaukee. If you're in Illinois, you're going to be going out to areas like Chicago. If you're in New York, obviously New York City. If you're in California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, etc. And all these areas are going to have one thing in common. They're not red areas with it, and if you look at on the map, they're not producing it. Now that means something other than your reduction in regulations and reduction in tax rates is luring these people in, or if you want to review it in reverse, something that the actual people in the area that are doing is scaring the businesses away. This means either A, there's people that do not have the qualifications. That's number one. Number two, the actual ideas in the area are outside of it when it comes down to non-economic areas with it are actually making it bad to do business. Because frankly, with it, when people do business, it's not just about how much money they can save with it. They need to make people actually feel comfortable and to be able to do their job. And if they don't like the actual environment they're in that they have to go home to, they're not going to be able to lure these people in. That's why when we see a lot of these companies, they move down to like the southern states for they lower regulations and the lower tax rates. Eventually, what ends up happening is you'll find that they end up kind of staying on this small little blue island in kind of this whole Red Sea around them. And that's the way it ends up being. This is why you see these urban areas surrounded by these rural areas with it the rural areas are non-productive, and the urban areas are able to establish their own identity outside of that. That's completely different from the whole surrounding area. And you start looking at these rural areas, they just don't produce anything. You can go to any rural area in the country with it, any of these red areas within the country. You'll notice the same thing. They don't have major business. They just don't lure in major business because the fact is there's no it becomes very, very toxic for a lot of these people. They don't want to be in areas with the ideas that they're putting out. Now, what are these ideas? Well, this is something that has been pushed for quite some time, and it has been the ideas of social conservatism. Social conservatism does not lure in business. It scares them away. As I said, while there might be a few businesses that try to change the landscape around them and eventually try to spread that landscape, the whole area of business is against that. And then when it comes down to it, social conservatism has led these areas to become anti-business. Any factual evidence that shows where you can actually get growth, they're actually against it. Number one, they're against actual competition in labor. They're against actual free movement of people. Now, free movement of people would actually create a system in which you would develop more entrepreneurs. This is actually going to be beneficial to raise the wealth of a city. They actually are also against, in more recent times, even free trade. They've even come up with some of these odd conspiracy theories that basically try to state that this will lead to bringing down the country because we're not producing anything here. The fact is if you start to look at countries like Switzerland does not produce much in their country. They're an actual service nation, yet we see how wealthy they are. When you start to look at countries like that, that's what ends up happening. When you look at countries that are basically all manufacturing and all farming countries, they're very, very poor. They're not very wealthy countries. We can see that in certain areas in Europe. They're not very wealthy countries. You'll see countries in areas of Eastern Europe that actually maintain these ideas with it, and we see that they're not very wealthy. In fact, they're actually some of the poorest nations in Europe. And you see people that are trying to push these same ideas, like out in Hungary, that they're trying to push these god awful ideas. And this is exactly what's going on out there. And this is why when you start to look there with it, what ends up happening. And for those who say, well, we want to maintain our area and blah, 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 blah. Well, the fact is those rural areas with it, if you look comparatively to what people call quote unquote third world countries, those areas with it that are similar in design, like those rural areas here with it, people in those other countries, in those quote unquote third world countries, they would beg for actual development in those areas with it. But what ends up happening is development is slow and works out from the urban centers out, and it can many times take decades for them to get any type of development of jobs. And these people remain poor because of the fact of this. And yet we have people in this country obviously willfully wanting this, willfully wanting to turn their area into the equivalent of a third world nation, where they are basically left to be poor. And because they don't want change to their lifestyle. They feel oh, I don't want that city encroaching in on me. Well, the fact is that city is what is productive. The city area is what actually makes things productive. When you start going away from that, that's what things become non-productive. You can look at pretty much every nation around the globe with it. The most productive areas are always the urban centers. It doesn't matter what you think about the urban centers with it. That's the only way to actually become productive. You need to actually have these things. These are the ones that actually develop all of the things there. Now, you can actually still have the ideas of being lower regulation and economic conservatism, and actually lower tax rates, without, if you actually want to stick to it, without actually doing things that would scare off the businesses. They need to be open to ideas of bringing in immigrants. Immigrants are not the problem. The problem is the lack of competition. You need competition in all areas. Doesn't matter what we talk about with it. Competition in all areas is good, because if you don't do competition, you end up faltering and falling like any of these communist and socialist countries that have actually had these areas. That's what protectionism is. That's where protectionism ideas come from. And you're not going to get any change unless you end these things. And frankly, with it, our country was not even founded on immigration restrictions. If you look at actually our founding document, the Constitution, you'll actually see that the words immigrant and immigration never appear once. In fact, it's only to become a citizen that you have to go through any type of passage to become a citizen, and that's the only type of discussion in which our founders had disagreements over with the actual time in which it would take for someone to become a citizen, because they didn't want it to be too long, as it would scare away the highest quality workers and minds from across the globe. They did not want to limit people's freedom of movement, ever. And yet we find these rural areas want to make every excuse in the book. Oh, they're going to take our culture and all this other garbage with it. And and we've heard every other thing with it, like the white replacement theory and all this other stuff that actually comes out of nationalist Nazi Germany. And that is something in which that's where this conspiracy theory comes from, the great replacement theory, which is basically the idea of this someone's out there to replace you, and it's basically going to change the whole landscape. It's not. Basically, our foundation was for basically to take what is the best in the world and to essentially bring it all in. Let people fight for their positions. Doesn't matter when we're talking about work. Doesn't matter if we're talking about ideas of for work, for anything with it. It's always supposed to be competition for work, for business. They're always supposed to compete with one another. You're not supposed to get an actual help from the government putting their thumb on the scale. When they put the thumb on the scale, things get worse. And if you notice that things have gotten worse over the last 140 years, that's because that's where protectionism actually was engaged. And that started with immigration, with the Chinese Exclusion Act, and when it comes down to that, is you'll find that the Chinese Exclusion Act was basically something that was created for people to eliminate any type of competition. They actually found out that, in fact, not only did it, and it was supposed to help help out employment rates of the actual citizenry. They found out that it didn't, because the fact is, all it did is slow down production. They found out basically that eliminating these people from the country, all it did is slow down production and kill essentially any projects that they needed to do. This is why when we start to look at things, we need to view things in such a way that that we can actually that's when we start to look at policies, we need to look at policies that actually work. And protectionism doesn't work. This goes in both anti-immigration and anti-trade. Those are the two most popular protections things. This is why we see broken down cities, because they didn't want immigrants in their city. They didn't want to actually create business. They didn't want actually immigrants in their city overall, with its which both creates which they create new business, and they actually create competition out there, because they wanted all that protectionism. What ends up happening to these broken down cities is the companies eventually leave because there's nothing left there. And then they go, oh, to get this company not to leave with it, we want the government to step in and bail us out. And this is what always happens. What always happens every step of the way. And we need to realize that there is no reason for bailing out, for this whole bailing out of anything, because it's a whole waste of time. If they merely would actually be willing, and it's even worse for rural areas with it, because they don't even want any type of production. They just want their white bread society. And they go, well, how come we don't have our own type of restaurants and culture and stuff like that, type of popping up all these, and we're only seeing fast food restaurants? Well, that's your culture. Your culture is this white bread garbage, because you actually reject the actual culture that's been developing across the whole history of the nation. And you reject the actual history of the nation, which creates all of this. And that's why we end up seeing these places just go down to hell. And you can look all the way across the country. It doesn't matter what state you're looking at. You're always going to find these red areas that are basically broken down areas. And they want to keep their little broken down areas within this. What ends up happening. The only time we end up seeing a change is when you find a company that basically wants to change the social climate of the area. And the moment that happens, this ends up blowing up in their face. And because they don't want personal liberty to actually get in the way of their bigoted ideas. They basically think that they don't want immigrants, they don't want anybody that doesn't look like them to be in their area. They don't want, it doesn't matter, even if it becomes developing wealth. Now, eventually, at one time with it, they were, even if they got to a point, they would even be willing to let people in to at least develop some type of wealth for them, in the creation of business. They weren't willing to actually allow for people to compete for jobs with wanting for the free competition for jobs, but they're willing to actually allow some stuff for the creation of business. When they found out that eventually that ends up leading to these companies, leading to where the companies are going to want competition, they end up getting mad, and that's where you end up getting all these broken down towns. And they didn't they wanted all the benefits of being rescued with it without the problems associated with people who didn't look like them, people who didn't act like them. And that's why we end up seeing all these red areas with it. And as we see that the GOP and these red areas start to be more and more aligned with essentially radical views, the worse it's going to get for them. And what's going to happen is it doesn't matter what they offer any people to come in with it for business, or thinking that they're going to naturally develop business. The business is not going to naturally develop. If it hasn't naturally developed normally under any circumstances, it's not going to develop at all with it, because they're not looking for actual people. These people, when they create the businesses, they're not going, oh my God, I would create a business if it wasn't for the slightly high tax rate. That's not how people naturally in an area do that. That means they don't have any entrepreneurs in the area. These people do not want to actually risk their money. For those who are willing to risk their money with it, those are the ones that you need to bring in. Well, they don't want to bring these people in, and you'll find certain areas like this. Any type of broken down area that has no business, this is where they always complain. The proverbial things with even certain poor areas of urban centers with it, you'll find certain people that end up aligning with protectionist ideas, communism and socialism. That they'll say that it's these Asians that are coming in there building up the business, when it should be our types of people with it. And this ends up happening there, and we find that, and that's why these areas with it, beyond these Asian businessmen that try to basically come in and actually create wealth for the community, they become the enemies of the community for daring to create wealth. And this is what ends up happening in these areas with it, because you're not only going to find protectionism, you will find it on the left with it, but it's not going to be as great as we see in the numbers, because it's basically just in an authoritarian realm on the left. It's basically on the right with it. You're finding that it has been embraced for quite some time with some of these radical people that think that you don't want people who don't look like you, who don't act like you in your area, and that's what creates these rural areas with it. That's why when the GOP ends up, when you look at a map of where the GOP wins, it doesn't matter if we're talking a congressional map, or if we're talking presidential by county or by city, it always shows the same thing. The same thing is basically showing that the people that they're only winning these broken down areas within these rural areas. They can't win anything in the actual production areas. As I said before with it, when it comes down to the production with it, you're finding these areas that are basically, the bulk of them are, what they're doing is they're claiming they're economically conservative, and yet when it comes down to everything, they're the biggest government leeches of all. While I do not support the idea of government intervention in the market and the government giving out money with it, I mean, if you're going to have that, at least be a state that either A, breaks even, or B, puts more in than you take out. If you're a state that takes out more than you put in, you're an actual problem on the actual economy, and And frankly, with it, I don't think you should have as much say when it comes down to allocation of these funds, because we find that you're essentially a drain on the national economy, because you're not producing anything, as we find in these areas. But specifically when it comes down to the rural areas don't produce anything, and yet they ask for a bunch of public aid. That's what ends up happening. They don't produce anything. They ask for public aid every single time. These broken down red cities, they don't produce anything. They don't want to. Nobody wants to become an entrepreneur, and they get mad when these companies want to leave with it because there's nothing there. And they get mad when the companies go to another country with it because they're going actually to an urban center in that other country. And it's like, well, the government needs to stop them from doing that. Well, that's violent force, what the government's trying to do. The government's trying to essentially punish them for making a free decision that they want to make. That basically the people, number one, are not productive enough. They're asking for way too much in this country. And they're basically creating an environment in the actual city and county and states that they're in they're actually creating the system in which nobody wants to actually, no larger amounts of business want to actually go there and create these urban centers, which actually lure in more and more business, more and more high quality business that actually generates revenue. They don't want to do it. When we look at even some of these red states with it, or let's say like Georgia, for instance. Georgia, for the most part, is a red state. When we start to look at that, we can actually see that the actual area that's generating all of the business is actually Fulton County. Fulton County is actually a blue area. That's the only thing that it is. Fulton County is not a red area. And frankly, people need to realize this, that when we start to view that, is that when we see when we start to see these areas where we start to see that those are the ones developing the business, every area around it is doing nothing. And they're just drains in the economy. They can promise, oh, we'll have lower regulations and lower tax rate. Well, the fact is it doesn't matter at all if you're going to harass anybody that doesn't look like you, if you believe in such backward ideas that are basically built on bigotry and racism. So why would a business even want to come there? The actual high quality people that need to work there with it are not necessarily going to always look like you, so they're not going to want to actually stay there. And that's what ends up happening with these areas. And what ends up happening is these are the people that these areas that ends up sending people into DC, and they end up pushing for these ideas that are essentially shutting down any type of tourism for the country. Now, tourism is the only thing that actually is the only thing really right now that's being able to generate outside income for many of these areas, and they don't even want that. They don't want tourism with it because it's going to bring in outside people, and they think, oh, they might stay. What, you think they might stay and actually develop a business? If they actually develop a business with it, that's what's going to happen. And we see all these implications of what's end up occurred with it, and it's been the destruction of the country. It's far greater in the destruction of the country. What has happened with these bigoted, backwards ideas than we've actually seen from the actual creation of an income tax and a central bank. These have done far greater damage to the actual country, because it doesn't matter how much money you're spending in debt. if you're if your country's not producing anything, it doesn't even matter what if you have a central bank or if you're on or if you're actually distributing gold and silver as currency. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you if you have taxation at like a federal taxation or income tax with it, or if it's other types of taxation to pay for things or not. These things with it are not are such minor things next to the actual biggest thing, which is if you're not productive, if your country's not productive, it will go, basically the country will fold. This is actually what kills all of your socialist and communist countries with it, because they have so much area of it that's not productive, because they try to and they centralize it from the top with it of what they can produce and try to limit certain amounts of production. And this is what ends up creating, and there's no incentive to do any production. This is what protectionism does, and this is what they've been backing for a long time, because they don't want anybody actually getting in their areas and actually changing anything. This is the whole point. That's why when we start to view the things with it, it's not much of a surprise that people on that in this duopoly, that people on the left are getting a lot more business done in their areas than people on the right. It's more than actual just regulation and taxes. Yes, those are an actual burden on the business that they must take care of. But if they can still lure in those top quality people because of the area being conducive to luring them in, then it doesn't matter what's the regulation in comparison to what the regulation and taxes are. If you have one area that basically scares away top quality employees and doesn't want them there, and doesn't want really doesn't want the company there except for their tax revenue, what ends up happening is they're not going to that's not going to be a good area for business. You might get one business here or one business there that's trying to change the climate, but this is what's going to happen. That's why when people out in Texas started saying, "Oh, Tesla's moving out. Tesla's moving a I don't know if it was Texas or if it was Nevada. I think it was Tesla's moving out a factory in our area," and I believe it was Texas he ended up choosing. I'm not 100% sure. I can look that up. And while they're still in the Fremont, California with it, they moved their headquarters in Austin, Texas. Austin, Texas is not what we consider an actual conservative area. That's where they moved their headquarters. So they still had the place out in Fremont, California. If you look at the, as far as I know, for the factories. Yeah, they have one being what it calls they have one for Nevada. They have one for New York, and they have one for Texas as their gigafactories. And then they still have the main automotive plant in Fremont, California. which is still being used. And this is the thing with it, where he's not going to lead the Fremont, California thing with it. The headquarters are in Austin, so that's actually an actual liberal area in Texas. That's actually kind of a liberal stronghold in Texas. And this whole thing of saying that, oh, he's moving to Texas, and then obviously thinking Nevada as well. He's moving to these other areas with it. Well, frankly, with it is, it's not to actually help out and actually be part of this conservative idea with it, be out to these red areas. This is not what it's for with it. This is actually to change the actual areas. We still see what it calls and we have for his facilities with it, he has Fremont, California, Story County, Nevada, which is 2016. He opened Buffalo, New York, Shanghai. He has one out in just outside of Berlin that he's doing with it, and he has one in Texas, which is in Austin. Still, what I call it, the most employees with it is Shanghai. And for the headquarters with it, the other ones were in the U.S., but they're all tied at about 10,000 employees. Austin, the one in Germany, and the one in Fremont, California, all about 10,000 employees. The one in Nevada, 7,000, 1,500 for the one in Buffalo. So frankly, with it, when it comes down to it, is when these people on the right thought it was going to be a this big change in thing, and these companies are going to start leaving California for it. Well, frankly, he has not left California. He won't leave California. And frankly, the area that he's going in Texas is actually a blue area in Texas, which is probably going to cause an actual spread in the areas beyond that. That's going to create more. That's going to create possibly Texas to actually flip blue. There's been talk of that, and that's what needs to be understood. Is that it's not going to be a red area anymore. When we start to see the things in it, we start to see what's actually going on in Texas. Texas is basically pretty much outside of the couple of urban centers. Pretty much, they're the equivalent of Saudi Arabia. Sorry to tell people with this, but that's basically it. They're solely reliant on petroleum production. They don't produce anything else, and that's basically what they're reliant on. They have they think they can run themselves as their own country, because they're not even they're not allowing energy trade from outside of their areas, and this is something which should be considered a big problem for anybody that would actually be in the country, in the actual state, because they just don't produce anything, because outside of these urban centers and petroleum, and they're not actually producing anything in it. Now when you start to look at it, they end up breaking even. But we saw what happened with their whole let's be off the whole federal grid system with it, because we disagree with what actual engineers actually think should be for our actual energy grid. And lo and behold, because not only did their energy grid shut down, they didn't even have any immediate access to energy, causing essentially the price of energy to spike during last winter. And this shows you with it that what they're doing, they're essentially completely backwards. And this is not. And when people try to use the excuse of saying it's like libertarian, it's not libertarian, because they were against allowing their actual citizens to trade with other states, because that would require them to actually submit to the federal regulations. And that little bit of regulations, they were actually recommended by actual engineers, and it's very, very minimal. This is why they're the only state that does this. It's meant to actually ensure that your energy production is safe and effective, and make sure it's efficient. And what ends up happening is, well, their energy grid shuts down, and that's what you get. And this is where they get completely backwards. And you get people that are willing to support these backwards policies and willing to jump on any red meat with it because of the stuff with it, just to maintain their little rural societies that are solely reliant on government handouts, such as you'll find farming subsidies, such as a lot of farming subsidies, things like that they know without those things, these areas would go completely broke. And this is the whole idea that these things are that they go that these areas would go completely broke if they had to be functional on their own with it. If you would essentially create a system in which you take all the blue areas, all the productive blue areas out of the country, eliminate the federal government from taking any debts and being able to support any of their little handouts, all these areas would go broke, and it would probably take about a month. None of these areas would even be sustainable. And that's the whole point, is that they're not willing to actually create a sustainable system because they don't want that. That would essentially be pro-business, to be sustainable, to create a sustainable business thing where they're actually not leeching off the actual federal government. This is why when you get, this is why we look at the federal government from the actual thing. It doesn't matter what member we're talking about. They're glad to take handouts. And even when the government gives handouts with it that they didn't vote for, they're willing to take a victory lap on it. You had what it called Rand Paul and Thomas Massie were the first ones when it came to tornado relief, beg President Biden for tornado relief. When they were like, when they had stuff like Hurricane Sandy up in New Jersey, they were the first ones to criticize Chris Christie for taking relief with that. Yet when we look at New Jersey actually puts in more than they take out. So frankly, with it, if New Jersey was able to do it without the federal government intervention, they would have actually had the funds to actually take care of these things. But they didn't, because there are states like Kentucky that actually were stealing money from the actual federal government so that they can get their little farm subsidies and other types of subsidies within their own state, and then go to Washington and complain about these things with it, without any problems jumping right back at them. They were just fine with it having their state take all this money, but when the first time when it comes back to them with it, when they're actually begging for it, and it gets out to being public, they're the first ones out there. This is why when it comes down to things with it, they're not willing to actually. None of these states would be willing to actually be self-sufficient. That's what it comes down to. None of these red areas want to be self-sufficient, because that requires them to actually take all of their social conservatism and throw it out the window, take all their protectionism, throw it out the window, realize that the free movement of people, free trade, and all labor restrictions with it are the things that are actually causing issues, and that they're basically all they are pretty much socialists and communists in disguise, because they're asking for exactly the same exact things, and they don't want to admit it. Doesn't matter who you're talking about, and they've used socialism and communism as buzzwords over all these years, and they try to use these things as saying, "Oh, we don't want this, we don't want that" with it, but they're just finding protectionism with it, exactly what the socialists and communists are asking for. They're no different than Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is no different than people like Rand Paul and Thomas Massie. Same exact thing with it. They're just fine with protectionism, but when it comes down to everything, they what it calls they'll talk a big game when it comes down to DC with it, but when it actually comes down to it, they're just fine to take all of those subsidies. They don't want to say no to those subsidies with it because it would expose their state as not being sustainable. They know that they would actually have to create these areas would have to become they'd have to have more urban centers and actually become open to free movement of people, open immigration, where basically if you had a medical background check and a background check and a medical check with it, you're free to go. You're free to move wherever you want. And I think that should be for everyone with it. I think if you don't pass it with it in the United States, I think you should not be allowed. So those people that storm the Capitol should not have free movement. I think they should not have the right to go to any other country with it. They should be bound to this country because of what they did, because they're an actual terrorist risk. There are also all these anti-vaxxers with it. They should because they refuse to get a vaccine, they should not be allowed to fly. And this is the whole thing with it, where this is the way these things should do it with it, because that's how you establish an actual rapport of how you deal with these things. Deal with these things and basically stop these people from actually doing that, because frankly, if you can't pass a basic health check and a background check, frankly, you should basically if you're a terrorist risk, or if you're not vaccinated with it or have health issues with it, you shouldn't be able to leave the country at all. And I think that's more than reasonable of a thing to basically make sure that the country is safe and make sure that we can get as many tourists in here as possible. The fact is with it is they know that they would be with all these members back with it, they know that they would not be allowed to move anywhere. They'd be blocked. Yet people like me with it, I was able to freely travel with it because I'm not an actual terrorist risk. Libertarians would be just fine with it. Your people in your red areas that believe all these insane things and that are nationalists with it would actually be an actual risk, so they wouldn't be able to travel. And frankly, with it travel is not a right. If you provide yourself as an actual terrorist risk with it, you shouldn't be able to gain entry. And if you can't pass the same health check that people have to do to enter the country, you shouldn't be able to enter the country either. And this is what ends up going through. And this is why when we start to go about like anti-business, they're not for business. They want regulations on basically what businesses can decide. They don't want businesses to decide if it's in their best interest to go with an actual vaccine mandate, which is actually good for their customers and good for their other employees. They don't want them to do that with it. They want to step in. They think that they can decide how businesses can be run. And this is the whole thing with it. They're just authoritarians. And that's what needs to be understood is this is why why we have to actually look at it, and it shows that basically the left is far more open to these things with it. I mean, excluding from people like Bernie Sanders, but the left is far more open to things. But I mean, basically, is we have all of our problems with the supply chains because of your people, because of Donald Trump and all these other people who pretty much let him do all the things he wanted to do to destroy the actual economy. And his little minimal cutting of regulations of financial regulations and of like business regulations and minimal cutting of taxes didn't do a damn thing. All it did was when he put more restrictions on personal liberty across the board for individuals with it, it makes it where it becomes a toxic environment. And no business wants to deal with that. No business wants to basically explain, hey, I can't do that. You can't do this. You can't do that in these states with it, just because these crazy people want to actually tell you how you can and can't live your life. And it goes more than just being actually pro-life, because they're not even pro-life. They're just basically anti-abortion. If they were actually pro-life with it, they would actually show themselves as being against the death penalty, which is state murder, and they would be against war, which is against state murder. It just overseas. So if they're actually pro-life with it, they would be against those things with it, but they're not. They're just anti-abortion, just their little red meat's issue, one of their red meat issues. And when it comes down to everything, they're anti-immigration, they're anti-trade. They basically, and their actual anti-education with it. They don't even want basically discussion of ideas. They've shown it. They've shown they're actually fearful of discussion of ideas, and this is what it boils down to. They're fearful of that. And this is something in which we're finding that these people are fearful of even discussing ideas with it, and that's why they want to use the full force of government. Yet they don't even pay into the thing with it. They actually they actually take out more than they're actually putting in. These whole areas with it, whole areas. Yet they're sending representatives to say, we want to take out more, take out more. Keep robbing these other people with it. They're the biggest thieves that you'd ever find. And that's what it's coming down to. They're thieves. They're no different than they're no different than anybody that's doing a smash and grab loot on a business. It's the same thing. They're just doing it to taxpayers, and they're doing it behind your back with it because you can't see directly who their faces. And that's exactly who these people are. And they try to blame the these other areas with it that are actually sustainable, that are actually saying, okay, we're putting in more than we're taking out, and yet we're taking out this amount of money for for these certain programs. They don't want to admit that they're basically a pit of government waste. These other states are, that these red areas are nothing but a pit of government waste. And that if they were forced to be made to be fully sustainable, that they couldn't. They would to actually work on their own. They know that they would go bankrupt within a month. Within that month, they would be gone. They'd be just a desolate place with it that they couldn't even function. Even some of these third world nations with it, at least they can become somewhat functional with it by being able to work, of doing something. They're willing to do something with it because they actually take opportunity. They'll actually take whatever opportunities come their way. These people, they don't want opportunities. They actually just want to continue with their bigotry. And that's what it boils down to. They're just bigots. And they find that bigotry is more important than actual economic opportunity. And they're willing to sink the economic opportunity, their areas with it, to maintain that bigotry. And it is, if you look at who they're sending into their legislature from these piss ass areas, we see that that's all they're concerned about. They're concerned about actually sending in people who are basically going to loot the actual treasury and steal from these productive areas and send money out basically so that their constituents can basically remain non-productive and basically say, hey, I can be non-productive and do nothing and complain all day and complain about how the world's against me. The same thing that all your Bernie bros are doing. They can complain about how the world's against them and how and all these other things and all these other little grievances that they come up with. That's all it's about. That's all it's been about for a long time. It's just a bunch of grievance culture, and they don't want to actually admit that they're the actual ones that are causing all this stuff with it. They're the politically correct ones with it. They're the actual ones who are actually causing the cancel culture. They're the ones that are actually against the actual Constitution. They're the ones that are actually against the Bill of Rights, and they've always been against it. They would have called they fake interest in it when it comes down to it. That's all what it's about. It's all about faking interest in it. And they come up with these fake ideas of, oh, we need to do this with it, and this is what the founders really meant, when they never did. You can actually look at the founders' writing. The founders actually wanted the free movement of people. And you'll find these people, they'll make up everything. Even people in Congress, they'll make up everything with it, of what they did with it. We found that they'll try to basically twist and turn the meaning of everything for this. And that's why they're never productive. These areas are never productive. It's always business moving to these blue areas. I'm not saying that I support high taxation and high regulation, but they're doing it. They're moving there with it because these are where these productive people are. These are where they can actually get areas in which they're not going to be dealing with problematic people. These aren't going to be your people who are going to be bigoted, that that their workers are going to have to fend against. That's why. Now the idea with some of these areas, with some of them trying to actually move into some of these red states, is trying to eventually move the state over into being blue to actually turn over the thing and actually get social change. That's the whole idea. And to end this garbage that's going on, to actually make these states productive, because they know they're going to have the influence over the area. And when these people go, see, these people are leaving these blue states, that's not enough to leave a blue state to actually cause any actual change in the actual election, but it's actually enough to actually cause change to the in that one state. That's enough to cause actual change in the new state. This is how things end up occurring with it, how states actually change. And what's going to happen with it eventually is you're going to see, if they keep going down this road, what's going to happen is gerrymandering and trying to limit people's access to voting is only going to go so far, because the moment you get some bare level of advantage with it, they're going to put in it's going to go through with voting rights, and they're going to be pushing it, because even no matter what they do with it, it's only going to go so far with it, because the fact is, if we start to look at the actual map, it's not looking very good for the GOP. It's looking like the House is probably going to remain about the same, because there's some people, Republicans, who won in blue areas with they're likely to lose in this election, as well as some of the new created districts are about to pick those areas right back up, and you're going to get basically a break even. When it comes down to the Senate, it looks like the Senate's going to be a -3 for the GOP. So when it comes down to it, they're not going to fare very well. So it doesn't matter what type of gerrymandering they do, they're not going to fare very well, because it's going to be thinner and thinner and thinner the more they try to gerrymander. And the more they try to do these pandering things of saying about the voting fraud that never existed, the more that's going to actually anger a lot more voters. And they're going to say this is a bunch of garbage and this is a bunch of hogwash and this is just a pander to a person's to basically a person's small ego, because he can't handle any type of people that are actually going against his ideas. He knows that he knows that they know that that basically that Trump can't accept the loss. He couldn't. He wasn't willing to in the primaries when he went in the GOP primaries for the 2016 nomination, and he was showing it back then with it. The Stop the Steal movement with it was actually started by Roger Stone back then, and this is something that's not new with the whole thing that went on. So this goes down to something that's not new with them, and that all they do is they just went more insane to the whole thing, and they're showing that basically, and they're being shown for their hypocrisy of always being economically liberal and just being socially conservative, aka bigoted, from the start. So they offered nothing. They've shown that they've never offered anything. So anybody with any brains realizes that there's no reason to actually stay with the GOP. And people realize that basically this book, because both major parties with it are going to be economically liberal regardless with it. When it comes down to it, is we're finding that in productive areas with it, they're more likely to be socially liberal as well. And the more socially liberal you are in those areas with it, the more production you're going to have. This is just natural what ends up occurring. The more regressive you are, regressive the area is, the less production you're going to have just natural in the areas with it. This is why you find these backwoods areas with it that always vote conservative. And then you find that you find the blue areas are always the urban centers. This is just what happens. And you'll always find people that want. You'll always find small numbers of people on the left that want protectionism with it, but they're a minority with it. Overall, protectionism is not popular, and we find overall in the country with it is that competition is what ends up winning out and actually making a country great. And if you want to make a country great, you need competition. You need, number one, you want actual tourism. So you don't want to limit people that actually enter the country. Number two, you actually want competition throughout the whole thing in labor. This is actually what actually creates, so you create the best possible product and at the best possible price. And you also want to bring in people that are also going to be entrepreneurs as well. And frankly, with it, when it comes down to it, we find that we find that basically is that the fact is that their function is basically is they think they can lure in some of these people, and it's not and it's not productive for these for these areas with it that are they're never going to become productive with it with these backwards ideas. And it's not until they're actually going to move past this. Now, that's why we should be referring to this as being regressive with what these red areas are doing, because they don't want actual development. And they've shown that they don't want actual development because they're afraid of competition in all areas. That's the whole idea. They're afraid of competition, and because they know if they had competition in labor, they had competition. If they allowed people to freely move and come in and make their own companies, then the fact is they couldn't use protectionism for basically protecting their little big donor companies for the ones that do that, which protect, which basically give them money when it comes down to the political donations, and they don't want actual tourism with it, because the fact is they don't want people. It boils down to just bigotry. It means money. All this stuff means money with it, and it could possibly also cause a change in the actual visual area of these whole things. That's why I've even made a statement with it. It's like some of these areas in Kentucky hit by the tornado. Sometimes you couldn't even tell if it's hit by a tornado because they're so backwoods. That's what it called. That they actually normally, some of those areas normally look like that. That they just look like garbage everywhere, and this is what the actual kind of the whole area naturally looks like. And you find these total backwoods areas that do this, and they don't want to change when it's like, well, how do you even tell the difference when they actually get hit by a tornado? And I'm sorry for being what I call insensitive, but this is the whole point: is they're not willing to actually admit, they're not willing to actually have any production in these areas. They want their they want their subsidies, they want their bailouts, they want all these things with it, but they don't want to actually be called out on wanting their subsidies and wanting their bailouts. They just want their free government money. They just want their free government money, produce nothing, and put nothing in the pot, and take everything out. They're leeches on everything. If they were actually forced to become independent, they'd actually go bankrupt. If we were to take Jeff Deist's idea of actually making 50 independent states, these states would not be functional. They would all go broke. In fact, with it, you might even find smaller areas with it, because I guarantee you those the urban centers would not want to be upholding these rural areas with it, because they would not want to basically be essentially be the financial backers to these rural areas. They would say this needs to end now, and they would want to basically separate from these rural areas. Let the rural areas go totally bankrupt, and let them actually have to fend for themselves from everything. They know that what I call the rural areas are non-functional. So they want to basically, they would not be wanting to basically be the whipping boy of basically that, where the rural areas complain all the time about the urban areas, but then they would want the urban areas money. And this is what it all boils down to. They want the urban areas money, but they don't want to actually what I call they could be like an urban area with it and actually be productive, but they don't want that. They would change the actual format of their society, and they know that. So I'm going to cut it here because I go on over all the points with it, and that's about it, and bye everyone.